Okay, guys, we made it to the last chapter. Chapter 17 is called The Promised Land. All right. Laura hastily resumed her descent and quickly reached the floor of the last cellar. Martin, wait! She cried. But the door onto the riverbank was wide open, and Martin had disappeared into the darkness. Suddenly, a strong hand seized Laura's arm and swung her around, holding his lantern so its light shone on her face. Joel demanded, Laura, what are you doing here? His eyes were fierce and probing. Laura met his gaze defiantly. Bert was arrested, so I brought Martin here. This is the right place, isn't it? She was not prepared for Joel's reaction. He set the lantern on the damp floor of the cellar and wrapped his arms around her. Laura, Laura, he murmured. Then he began to chuckle. He held her off and searched her face again. The rabbit in the trap, he said, still smiling. You couldn't bear to see Martin get caught, could you? He's not safe yet, Laura twisted away, and skirting the pool of water ran outdoors. Below her lay the steep slope of the riverbank, thickly covered with trees and shrubs. Martin, she called softly. It's all right. Joel's here. A clump of bushes between her and the river stirred, and Martin came out. Joel went to him and put his hand on his shoulder. So Laura took care of you? Yes, Mr. Joel. She brought me here through the woods without getting us lost once. A loud splash and an exclamation made all three of them whirl around. Joel picked up the lantern and in 2 long steps was again in the cellar doorway. George, he exclaimed. I forgot about you. What happened? The fugitive whom Laura had seen outside the church emerged from the cellar. He sounded amused as he did. I stepped in that pool. No wonder, Joel said apologetically. I went off with the lantern. George didn't seem upset. No harm done, just a wet foot. Joel pulled a watch from his pocket and studied it by the light of the lantern. It's time for your ride to the Promised Land, he said to George and Martin. Let's get down to the shore quickly. He held out his left hand. Come on, Laura. Laura hesitated. Walt. He's one of the slave catchers. Was on the road a few minutes ago. He may have followed us here. Joel stopped. I doubt it. I saw him heading back toward Lewiston. But just to be sure, we'll put out the lanterns. We don't need them. I could find my way in my sleep. Laura took his hand and started down the bank, though she still felt uneasy. Who could tell what Walt would do? He might have been pretending he was going to Lewiston, and in reality was planning to come back and surprise them. She stepped on a loose stone and shuddered as it went rolling down the bank ahead of her. Was Walt up there listening? Well, even if he is, she thought grimly, he's too late to stop Martin and George. Now the swift rush of the river reached her ears. The water here was deep and the current was powerful. Anyone who fell in would not survive very long. Be careful, she warned Martin. Don't get too close to the edge. Joel led them to a large rock near the water and dropped onto it, drawing Laura down beside him. George and Martin stood to one side, talking quietly. You said they arrested Bert, Joel said. Why'd they do that? On suspicion, Laura told him. It was our carriage that picked up George. Oh, of course. Now I see. Josiah Tyron told me one of our agents borrowed it. He knew Sally could outrun any other horse for miles around, but they can't prove Bert did anything wrong. Anyway, the judge is on our side. He just has to pretend to go along with the slave catchers. Then Mr. Tyron is the Underground Railroad? Laura said. Bert thought he was. Joel nodded. He's a fine man, the backbone of our operation in Lewiston. He and his wife spend their lives helping other people in all kinds of ways. How did you get out? This afternoon you were being guarded like a prisoner. The men finally gave up watching our house, and the minute they left, I went to Josiah and asked him what I could do. He told me where to find George and asked me to take him to meet the boat that was coming for Martin. Does Josiah Tyron own this house now? No, his brother Amos still does. But it was Josiah who had the idea of using it as the Lewiston terminal of the Underground Railroad. Amos agreed with the plan. Joel rose and stared upstream. I think the boat's coming. Laura looked too and saw a rowboat gliding toward them in the deep shadow of the bank. In a few minutes, Joel and George leaped down to the water's edge, seized the bow of the boat, and pulled it against the shore. Martin started after them, but then he turned around and came back to Laura. Thank you, Miss Laura. I can't ever thank you enough. Laura took his hand. All at once she had many things she wanted to say, but there was no time. Send word to us send word to us where you are and we'll come to see you, she told him earnestly. We'll be helping other slaves to cross the river too. She stood beside Joel, watching the boat start across the dark river. George and Martin waved, and then, as if drawn by magnet, they turned their faces toward Canada. In a few minutes, they'll be free, said Joel. When they pass the middle of the river, they're in Canadian waters. I hope they'll be all right, said Laura. Martin is such a young boy to have traveled so far alone. He's safe now. His father will be on the shore to meet him. Joel took Laura's elbow. How am I going to get you home in that outfit? They climbed up the riverbank before they again lighted the lanterns. With Joel beside her, Laura found that dark, empty cellars of Tyrant's Folly were no longer places of terror. To Laura's surprise, after they closed the front door behind them, Joel did not head for the lane through the woods. Instead, he took her arm and said, I want to show you something. Mystified, she let him lead her to the narrow terrace behind the house. There he pushed aside a curtain of wild grapevine and stopped at a huge boulder. Dropping Laura's hand, he set his lantern on the ground, leaned against the stone, and with a great effort pushed it aside. Laura was amazed to see that the boulder had concealed an opening in the ground. Joel lowered his lantern into the hole, and Laura dropped to her knees, stared into a rock-walled room the size of a pantry at home, with a vaulted stone ceiling. This is where the slaves hide while they're waiting for a boat to take them to Canada, Joel explained. I think it was built for the use of a cistern to hold rainwater, but it makes a good hiding place. Only the Tyrants, my father and yours, and I know about this. He paused. And now you know. Grateful for his trust in her, Laura said, Thank you for showing me. Bert and I thought there should be a safer place than the cellars. She had a sudden notion. Joel, this is where the men brought George after they picked him up at the church this afternoon. Joel laughed. You're a smart one. Yes, he stayed here until I came after him tonight. He returned the stone to its place. Last night, on account of the dogs, I couldn't bring Martin here. Anyway, he needed just what he had at your house, food and warmth and friends to talk to. They went down the lane, putting out their lanterns before they reached the river road. Joel had worked out a plan. We'll go back to my house, and if anyone sees us on the way, we'll hope they think we're just a couple of boys out for a late walk. Mother will fix you a bed for the rest of the night. Thank you, said Laura, that would be fine, but I must go home. Pa and Abby and Uncle Daniel will be back from Buffalo very early in the morning, and they'll be worried if they don't find Bert or me at home. At Joel's house, Mrs. Todd gave Laura a skirt to pull over her trousers and a cloak that covered the entire outfit. Laura came into the kitchen wrapped in the cloak, but still wearing Bert's cap. How do I look now? She asked Joel. He laughed. Almost like a girl. In a flash, he whipped off the cap, and her dark blonde hair tumbled onto her shoulders. Now you're yourself again. His eyes told her that was the way he liked her. Joel then said he had the horse and buggy waiting in front of the house. You don't have to take me, she said. I can walk home. Child, said Mrs. Todd. You must be exhausted. Laura considered this. I am tired. Mrs. Todd kissed her cheek. It's a brave thing you did tonight. Was I brave? Laura wondered. She had done what she had to do. That was all. Of two things she was sure of. After tonight's business, she knew where she belonged and which side she was on. She had come home to stay. Laura and Joel were at the edge of town when Walt and his horse came clattering down Center Street after them. "Hold on there, young Todd," he called out. "Who's that with you?" He leaned closer. "Laura Eastman." He began to laugh deliriously. "So you gave us all the slip and went out for a buggy ride. I didn't know you had a sweetheart." Laura would have protested, but Joel said, "That she has," and drew his arm tight around her shoulders. All right, guys, that was the end of the book. I hope you enjoyed it. Go on today for your Google Forms and have a great day. Bye.